Welcome. As you know, I'm Nina Zaneri. I'm director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, and this is the last in our series. The series title was 18th-Century Massachusetts Furniture, Form, Function, and Fabrication. Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce David Wood. He's the longtime curator at the Concord Museum. He has a BA from the University of Colorado, MFA in printmaking from the University of Iowa, and an MA in art history from Boston University. So we will leave Boston and head north, much as Revere did, to hear the story of the best workman in the shop, cabinet maker William Munroe of Concord, Massachusetts. Please welcome David Wood.
Great. Thank you. In a remarkable autobiography written in 1839, when he was 61 years old, William Munroe recorded details of life within an 18th-century cabinet-making shop that can be found nowhere else. He wrote of expectations, disappointments, motivations, and satisfactions candidly and honestly. From his account, it can be seen that his career was guided by factors that include international politics, fashion, self-esteem, and good food. The autobiography and numerous records from Munroe's shop, including 5 account books, are the generous gift to the Concord Museum of William Munroe's great-great-grandchildren, Bill and Charlie Munroe, and form the basis of this presentation, a chronological consideration of William Munroe's training and career as a cabinet maker in Boston and Concord between the years 1792 and 1819, related as much as possible in Munroe's own words. And these are those account books that I used as evidence. Oop, wrong one. William Munroe was born in Roxbury in 1778. Part of the 5th generation of his family in America, he was the grandson of a patriot killed in Lexington on April 19, 1775, and this is Doolittle's engraving of the encounter on Lexington Common. He was the grandson of another patriot who participated in the Boston Tea Party and was the son of a trader in West Indies goods. Munroe grew up in the house that his father, Daniel, owned on Roxbury Street in the heart, and Roxbury Street is Washington Street, in the heart of the busy web of craft shops that characterized Federal-era Roxbury. But busy as it was as a manufacturing center, Roxbury in the 1790s also retained a rural aspect, as the Chicago Historical Society's view of Meeting House Hill by John Riddle Penniman attests. William's grandfather, Jonathan Parker, the Tea Party participant, had a dairy farm and orchard that his grandson remembered fondly for its fresh apples and white pot, baked apples and milk. In 1792, at age 13, William was placed by his father to work as a boy on the farm, but being not very strong nor liking to work hard on a farm, I complained to my father and was thereupon asked by him which I had rather do, work on the farm or return home and go to school. William stayed on the farm for the season and afterward attended school, but with indifferent progress. Munroe described his education as being of a very limited character, consisting only of arithmetic and common handwriting. He was uneasy in school, in part, he believed, because his absences made him a perpetual stranger in class. When about 14 years old, my father put me as an apprentice with a Mr. Mills, a wheelwright by trade in Roxbury Street. The business was not well suited to my inclination or my strength, Munroe wrote, again citing his overall constitution as a factor in choosing a trade. After about 5 months, he went home sick and did not return, having cut a tendon in the middle finger of his left hand, which left him unable to move one joint. Munroe had one other cause for complaint. We had for 6 days in a week mush, salt fish, and potatoes for dinner, and nothing else. After I had recovered my health, I was carried by my father to Dorchester to be an apprentice at the cabinet business to a Major Stephen Badlam, Esquire. Although Daniel Munroe was clearly still responsible for placing his son in an apprenticeship, William had reasons of his own to enter Badlam's shop. He wrote, "I was now about 15 years old and recollect having an ambition to learn the cabinet business, which at the time, this was 1794, was profitable and desirable. Stephen Badlam," and this is Stephen Badlam's mark on a tray that we'll see shortly, kept quite a number of hands and had a good shop. Unfortunately, William soon came to be under a strong conviction that I should not acquire the trade at that place. Apprentices, as a general rule at this shop, were employed about 2 years at helping saw veneers, turning a large lathe wheel, and at farming. Moreover, apprentices were kept very meanly as to food. After nearly a year in Stephen Badlam's shop, Monroe returned home by leave of my father, but without leave of absence from Mr. Badlam. Clock cases like this one, which is a privately owned example, occur with Badlam's mark. One of the more interesting things Monroe has to say about Badlam was that he did not work at the business himself. Here then is a good shop with a number of hands, headed by a man who spends no time at the bench. That Monroe notes the fact suggests it was a little out of the ordinary, but we'll see that it's not a unique circumstance, and it was in fact the sort of detached relationship to the shop that Monroe sought for himself for most of his career. After I had remained at home a short time, I was placed by my father as an apprentice to a Mr. John Paddleford, a cabinet maker in Roxbury Street. This is a piece dated 1806 and signed by Paddleford as it appears in a 1946 Antiques magazine ad. Paddleford was a good workman, and Monroe trained in his shop between 1795 and 1796 until he could make a good mahogany desk, which were at the time in high fashion. But when Paddleford resolved to relocate to Taunton in southeastern Massachusetts, Monroe, despite being offered a $100 bounty to be paid when he was free, did not accompany him. This time the motivation was something other than food. William Munroe's father was concerned that he might not get the trade perfectly by moving into the country. But William had himself determined not to go. Paddleford was more given to politics than work, took snuff to excess, and was not in very good circumstances as to property. Moreover, Monroe's decision was partly owing to a brother-in-law of his, that is, of Paddleford's, who was also an apprentice to him and who, being a little older than myself and also possessed of some property, made him feel very large and assumed power to domineer over and insult me with impunity. I was therefore gratified that I was likely to be released from his companionship. Meanwhile, an arrangement had been made by my father with Deacon Nehemiah Monroe, a cabinet maker in Roxbury Street, for me to be an apprentice to him, and it was said at the time that Paddleford received a sum from the deacon as a remuneration for giving up so good an apprentice, and also so good a workman as Monroe was reputed to be. This miniature sideboard, you can hardly tell from the slide that it's a miniature, but it's only about this tall. This miniature sideboard in the Winterthur collection is attributed to William and can be taken to represent the skills he learned from Nehemiah Monroe. We'll take a closer look at this in a moment. Although William doesn't mention the relation, the deacon was his second cousin. Born in Lexington in 1747, Nehemiah Monroe died in Roxbury in 1828, leaving an estate valued in excess of $22,000. You have to multiply that by 60 or so to get an idea what that is in modern money. In 1796, when William Munroe entered the shop, Nehemiah Monroe was in partnership with a former apprentice of his, John Clapp, doing business as Monroe and Clapp. Clapp was the chief director of the business and overseer of all the hands, the deacon not being an operator accepting the procuring of stock and supplies necessary for the shop and other outdoor concerns. So here again, as in Badlam's shop, the principal does not work at the bench. However, Nehemiah Monroe did have responsibility for training a new generation of craftsmen. The deacon had the largest half of the hands, and being one of his apprentices, my being one of his apprentices, was a fellow apprentice with 4 others: Lemuel Churchill, Ephraim Capon, William Viles, and Daniel Pierce. Lemuel Churchill was born in 1775 and was a journeyman with William Fisk in 1799. William Viles was born in 1779, was also a journeyman with the cabinet maker William Fisk, and sold furniture through John Doggett. Daniel Pierce was born in 1779 and was associated at one point with the cabinet shop of William Leverett, which was one of the busiest cabinet-making shops in Federal-era Boston. I remained at this place as an apprentice until I was 21 years old, Monroe recorded, but his tenure there was not without incident. I had been there about a year when it so happened that the coat I wore daily had become quite dilapidated, and in leaving it off to be repaired, I had put on my best. This of itself would seem to be but a very small crime, but owing to the apprentices not being allowed to have their stints, and stints means a little time of your own to do some work of your own on the side for your own profit, whereby they might gain a little time for themselves, as was customary among others of the same occupation, they became in some measure cross and refractory, and had by some means expressed it to the deacon, and which made him, as well as themselves, in a not very pleasant mood toward each other. In this state of things, the deacon came into the shop, and finding me at work with my best coat on, he immediately took fire. I endeavored to reason with him on the necessity of my having my old coat mended and of wearing my best one until it could be done, but he would not hear to my reasoning, and considered it as meant as an insult to either him or the females in the house, whose duty it was to keep the apprentices' clothes in decent repair, and finally told me he had nothing further for me to do. William's father managed to smooth over this incident, but the fact that the wearing of the wrong coat could escalate to a crisis like this is remarkable and speaks of some tensions that must have been present in the shop. Monroe records two other incidents, seemingly petty, but obviously of passionate importance to the participants. Breakfast and supper in Nehemiah Monroe's household consisted of bread and milk with chocolate for breakfast on Sundays. But the apprentices wanted chocolate for breakfast every day. They struck for the right, having resolved to leave the shop over the issue if necessary, and they won. Dinner was the main meal of the day, and the boys thought it a humiliation the way they had to hand their plates to the family's table to be filled. So again they struck, and again they won. And it is but justice to remark, says William, that whatever we did have was always of good quality and enough. During my apprenticeship, I had become the best workman in the shop. All extra work that required nicety, carved work, or any new fashion that had not been made in the shop before was committed to me. Yet now, although a freeman and esteemed a good workman, I felt as if thrown upon an ungrateful and unfeeling world and subject to all its ills. I was, however, immediately employed as a journeyman in the same establishment and continued to make the best of the furniture. I remained, however, but a little over 5 months when my brother Daniel was desirous and strongly urged me to come to Concord to make handsome mahogany clock cases for him, he having set up the clockmaking business in that town, a business then profitable and clocks then fashionable. Monroe, in his account book, provides further description of this furniture listed here, the furniture he made in that 5 months that he worked as a journeyman, noting that the sideboards were sash-cornered, as were the card tables. And this is a privately owned sash-cornered sideboard attributed to Thomas Seymour, and you can see by jiggering the images a little that it bears a remarkable resemblance to that miniature sideboard in the proportions, in the curve of the skirt, in the spade feet, and in the inlay patterns. So I want to go back to the miniature sideboard, which you see on the left, the sideboard that's at Winter Tour, because it is a remarkable piece, and it had a remarkable subsequent history. Here it is pictured in the lower right in the miniature stairwell at Winter Tour in a stereo view from 1935. This is long before Winter Tour was opened as a museum, but the sideboard was already famous. And here it is on the porch of the house that it was sold out of in 1931. It had descended in the family. William Munroe's great-granddaughter was on a farm in upstate New York. They needed money, 1931, times were tough. They needed money to plant for the year, so they sold the sideboard. It was a great grief to her. She wept when it was sold. And it was sold for $400 in 1931, 400 gold dollars. It was bought by a dealer who drove up in a Bentley. And that dealer, his name isn't known, but that dealer either was Joe Kindig or he sold it to Joe Kindig, because Kindig sold it to Henry Francis DuPont at Winterthur in 1934 for $1,300, more than 3 times what was paid for it. And about 2 times the cost of a brand new Ford in 1934. This was an expensive little thing. And what it was, a miniature furniture is kind of mysterious. What's it made for? It was not a toy. This particular piece was actually a love token. These are the conjoined hearts on the top. It was made as a gift to William Munroe's new wife, Patty Stone, in 1805. So back to what Monroe was making in the, as a journeyman. His chairs were probably analogous to these, with the $2 chairs on that list we just saw being described in his account book as square-backed with carved ribs, and like the one on the left, and the $3 chairs are sash-cornered, like this one on the right. That jog in the corner is called sash-cornered, newest fashioned with carved ribs. That was the work that I did during the 5 months. The price of my board had to come out of it and left me not far from $100. I thus left Deacon Monroe's shop, spent some time in collecting together such tools, patterns, and so following as was necessary for the purpose of making clock cases, spent about all I had earned for this purpose. The tools Monroe gathered came from the shop of L. Little on Roxbury Street, presumably a hardware dealer. He bought 17 planes, double and single iron jointers, 4 planes and smoothing planes, as well as round, rabbet, floating, hollow, and OG planes. Monroe bought 2 planes that were meant specifically for clock cases, a bead plane for the large door, that's the waist door of a clock, and this molding we're looking at is a bead molding, and also a nosing for the large molding. So that curve that you see on the left, that's the large molding above the waist door, and so the plane that cuts that is called a cove. Monroe also bought a set of gouges and a set of chisels, 7 saws, a dozen hand screws, a square, a hammer, dividers, gimlets, and a few other tools. Monroe arrived in Concord on the 1st of June in the year 1800. Here's Concord in 1775 in a painting in the Concord Museum collection. You can see the body of water there is the mill pond, which was drained in the 1850s, and the stretch of Main Street that runs along the mill dam, where some of those troops are standing there to the right of the pond, was known then and is still called the mill dam. The tools I had bought, the few clothes I had, and $3.45 in my pocket constituted all the property I possessed in the world. The $3.45 I loaned to my brother Daniel, but was not returned to me until some months after in a settlement of accounts. My brother Daniel was an excellent workman at making clocks. He served his time with Samuel Willard, a celebrated artist in that business, both for church clocks as well as other brass 8-day clocks and timepieces, and the inventor of the patent timepiece. Daniel had taken his brother Nathaniel into partnership with him about the time I moved to Concord. Brother Nathaniel served his time at clockmaking with a Mr. Hutchins at Concord, New Hampshire, and was also a good workman. The shop that this business of clock and clock case making was to be carried on was a 1-story building. And here the building second from the left, now with the 2nd story added in this view of what the mill dam looked like in 1810, is the shop that Monroe is talking about. And then the one all the way over on the right is the shop that later became William Munroe's cabinet making shop. The view below is the mill dam today. All those little manufacturing shops were removed in the 1820s, and these brick-ended buildings were put up in 1829 and 1830, and the mill dam hasn't really changed since then. The pond was drained at the time these new buildings were put up. The low building there with the two awnings is about the location of the clockmaking shop. Monroe, as he wrote, made my bench, set up my tools, and having had stock and materials collected together, I here began to make clock cases. I was to have $7 each for making a particular kind, and for those of more work, I was to have more. The stock and other materials for the purpose being provided for me, and also my board. I continued this work, together with some other jobbing, until July 1802. Some of the cases I had made were very large and elegant, and for which I had $9.25 for making. During this time, I made 52. This is an example of a $9.25 clock case that William Munroe made for his brother Daniel, an 8-day clock that's in the Concord Museum, and it was made for Joseph Merriam in Concord just about the year 1801. Notice the scrolled base and the flared French feet. We're going to look at those again. And here is a view of William Munroe's workmanship on the interior of this case. It's very neat work. You'll note that unlike Roxbury cases, the interior is unstained, which is the norm for William Munroe's clock cases. And here's a view of the complicated glue blocking that William Munroe employed in the corner. It's a 4-part glue block. It runs the full length of the waist. We're looking down on the top of the cove molding of this case. So it's a complicated blocking that's only found on Munroe's cases and in a few Roxbury cases. This is a timepiece in the Concord Museum collection that was made by Daniel Monroe about the year 1800 or 1801, with a case by William Munroe. And this is just a reminder that timepieces have movements as well as cases. And this is a pretty good indication of William Munroe's ability. There's in the corner up here, tied to anything, this joint here, we're going to look at that from a couple of angles. That's a mitered joint, and then it's also a dovetail joint that we'll look at. So this is a complicated joint that you really only find on the very earliest examples of Simon Willard's timepieces. That's the only other place where you find frames made in just this way. Shortly after that, they figured out how to they just started making a mitered joint in the corner without this extra business. And here's another view of that same joint in the waist of this same clock. But also take a look at this complicated inlay. And on this slide, actually in the previous slide, maybe on that bit of it up there at the top, you get just a hint. This was originally polychromed. That busy inlay there was originally red, white, and blue with those colors alternating on there. Michael Wheeler has made a reproduction of it. It was pretty hot stuff. So we're going to Photoshop this and see if we get an idea of what it looks like. I'm sure people will think it's in very bad taste when we put it back to the way it probably looked when new. This particular inlay is not found on any other Boston area furniture other than this very small group of timepieces. So it may be that William Munroe made it himself. In July 1802, I was taken in as partner with my brothers, and we endeavored to drive business. We continued as partners until July 1804. One more view of that joint from the top, you can see it's actually also a dovetailed joint. So this is actually complicated stuff, and in a very small area. That's less than 3/4 of an inch wide, that door. So this is the paper label of Daniel and Nathaniel Monroe, and it shows some of the means that they used to drive business. Clocks were sold by the dozen at a reduced price, and they could be boxed and delivered free to any port within 30 miles of Concord for transport. The 30-mile radius encompasses most of Massachusetts Bay, because Boston's about 20 miles from Concord, Salem to the north is just under 30 miles, and Quincy to the south is just over 30 miles. So the intent was that these could be shipped to a port for transshipment somewhere else, down south. Some of them went all the way down to the Sugar Islands. This is a privately owned example of a Daniel Monroe and Company 8-day clock. So it was made in that period, 1802 to 1804. And you can see that the base is somewhat simplified on this. It's just got a regular bracket base instead of that flared French foot and scrolled base we saw on the slightly earlier clock. But it's got the same brilliant veneers, and the workmanship on the unstained interior is just like what we saw before. This clock has the printed paper label of Daniel and Nathaniel Monroe, which they seem to use in their partnership, and it also has this mark, W. Pellet M. This seems to be something that Monroe learned from Stephen Badlam's shop to make a mark like this on pieces that you made, and the intent of this is they're called journeyman's marks, and it's so that you can get paid for what you make, presumably, although very few shops actually practiced this. Badlam's is one of the only shops in New England that did. Here's that tray we saw Stephen Badlam's mark on before, and here on the left is the journeyman's mark on the back of Abile White, who was a journeyman in Badlam's shop in the 1790s, and you can see how close it is to William Munroe's mark of 1802. There are several other journeyman's marks that have been identified on Badlam pieces, but they're rarely found on pieces from any other Massachusetts shop. The stamp that William Munroe used may have been the stamp that he bought from Mr. Little in 1799 for 75 cents. After the breakup of the partnership in 1804, William continued to work as a cabinet maker, making clock and timepiece cases, gun stocks, halberd poles, picture frames, cradles, bedsteads, card and dining tables, candle stands, profile frames, Pembroke tables, bureaus, trade signs for his brothers Nathaniel, Daniel, and John, John's trade sign being in the form of a watch. He made coffins for adults and coffins for children, a Martin house, pistol stocks, parasol sticks, gauge sticks, rules and want sticks, a desk and bookcase, a pine desk with drawers, and a crutch. It was probably during this period that William made this chest of 4 drawers, which remained in his family, made it for his own use, probably about 1805 when he made that miniature sideboard for his wife Patty. And in its neat construction and ornament, it agrees with the workmanship seen in his clock cases. It may be like the bureau that Monroe sold to Boston auctioneers Charles Nolan and William Gridley in 1811 for $28. And this piece should help to identify other pieces by William Munroe. Here's a couple of details. This is the flared French foot that occurs on that chest of drawers. And you can see that the flare, the angle of it, is actually worked out in the glue blocks behind it, which is kind of complicated. And most people dropped that little refinement in a hurry. French feet were only fashionable for a couple of years. And here's another view of a flared French foot on the back of a chest of drawers. But also here is the foot on that Daniel Monroe 8-day clock we looked at initially. And you see its construction, which is a distinctive construction with that just 1 and 2 degree angled cuts, really kind of tedious work, but consistent on this and on that, on this clock case and on that chest. And here's the dovetailing. Actually, on the left is the dovetailing of the smallest drawer on the chest of drawers, and on the right is the dovetailing on the largest drawer of the miniature sideboard. And you can see in the slight overshoot of the dovetails and the angles of the dovetails, it's really the same workmanship. But by 1812, finding that I could not dispose of so much furniture as I could make with my own hands, business of every kind extremely bad, clocks fast going out of fashion, my family expenses at the same time increasing and so following, I found that unless I could start some project whereby I could earn money faster, I should, in a few years at most, even if I should have my health, be poor. And Monroe did make the furniture with his own hands. His shop in Concord was the inverse of Deacon Nehemiah Monroe's. William Munroe trained no apprentices and employed no journeymen. Monroe tried various projects, including growing teasels for the woolen mills, making toothbrushes and watch brushes, complaining in 1839 that some of the watch brushes were still in the house, and then he turned to pencil making. The war had interrupted the supply of pencils from England, and Monroe took advantage of it with immediate success. These are examples of his pencils in the Concord Museum collection. Although he had difficulty finding graphite and cedar, he was soon contracting to make pencils by the thousand. William Munroe had expected the end of the war to end this opportunity for him, but it didn't, and he prospered. He went from an income of $700 a year to an income of $7,000 a year, and with one interesting exception that we'll take a look at next, he never turned back. I want to digress for a second. This cheerful fellow is William Munroe's neighbor and friend Caleb Bates in a portrait by John Dellon in the Concord Museum collection. Bates was a ship owner, a captain and supercargo. Here's his ship on a really magnificent Liverpool jug now in the Winter Tour collection. And in June of 1815, Monroe writes, I entrusted money to purchase black lead, that's graphite, in the hands of Captain Caleb Bates, who was about sailing for England, the war having ceased, and gave him a sample. On his return, he reported that he could not find it, and instead brought me the money worth in lead pencils. Of all articles, the least that I wanted. And here they are. These are the pencils that Bates brought back, pencils by Workman and Langdon of London, and they were still in the family. Monroe was never able to sell them until they were given to the museum in 2009. Monroe interrupted his successful pencil production in 1816. Here on a page from his account book, you can see charges to clockmakers Lemuel Curtis, Nathaniel Monroe, and Joseph Dyer, and on another page, this note. June 12, 1816, bargained with Nathaniel Monroe and Lemuel Curtis to deliver them 100 timepiece cases and boxes to be delivered as soon as convenient at $3.50 each. They are to pay me 4 timepieces complete with boxes at $27.50 for gilt doors and $25 for plain, to be paid on demand. Also, bargained with Ebenezer Wood to make me 150 timepiece cases and boxes, and am to pay him $1.25 each. He agreed to take 1 timepiece as pay, and all preparations to make the cases is considered in the bargain as my property. So Monroe was making $2.25 on each case and box that he delivered, and by box he means a simple trapezoidal pine shipping box. The expiration of Simon Willard's timepiece patent in 1816 seems to have inspired the Concord makers to ramp up production of timepieces. Monroe made 30 timepiece cases in 1807, but for most years, from 1804 to 1816, he made none at all. However, between 1816 and 1819, his journeyman, Ebenezer Wood, and after 1816, James Adams, produced 300 or 400 timepiece cases a year. Munroe at last headed a shop that he didn't work in. Here's an example by Joseph Dyer from this period. So in other words, Joseph Dyer's name is on the dial, here's the interior. One distinctive feature of Concord timepieces is the shaping of the inside of the head where the movement is mounted. On the left is a Boston and Roxbury example, which tend to have parallel sides to the head, but that's wasteful of wood. In the Concord example on the right, the interior cut of one piece forms the exterior of another piece, so there's really very little waste, and that's an innovation that, to the manufacture of these that William Munroe seems to have introduced. Here's another view of the lower part of this clock with these, there was some sort of spring saw involved that's responsible for these very tight saw kerfs. And here's a detail of the glue blocking in the lower case. All the blocks are chamfered. They are placed very consistently from clock to clock. This is not the case with Roxbury cases. And again, the interior is unstained, and again, there's very often stain or a thin paint on the interior of Boston Roxbury clocks and timepieces. The backboard also conserves wood being because it has a trapezoidal central element that's pieced out on the side. So instead of cutting this from the solid and throwing all the negative pieces away, this one is made more economically. No matter whose name is on the dial, Concord timepiece cases are perfectly consistent because they were all made in William Munroe's shop. In 1819, the clockmaking binge ended, at least as far as William Munroe was concerned. Nathaniel Monroe had gone to Baltimore in 1817, and in 1821 and 1822, Lemuel Curtis and Joseph Dyer moved on to Vermont. William Munroe continued to produce pencils wholesale, entirely with journeyman labor from Ebenezer Wood, James Adams, and several others, including some indigent Boston cabinet makers, and by 1839, he had $20,000 in the bank. William Munroe was a good citizen of Concord, about as well connected as anyone could be. He was a member of the First Parish and of the Social Circle. He was a member of the Fire Society and the Concord Light Infantry, an investor in the banks and the insurance company that had essentially replaced manufacturing on the mill dam, but the best workman in the shop had left the bench. Thank you.
When did the spelling of the name change? Because the pencils were
M-O.
M-O-N.
Yeah, probably when President Monroe entered the White House. William actually was the only one in his family to do that. He changed it to M-O, and then he changed it back. His son always used the M-U spelling, but once he changed it on the pencils, it was like a trademark. And in fact, somebody made counterfeit Monroe pencils at one point. So the M-O-N-R-O-E spelling, they had to stick with it. It was like a trademark. But the family today spells it M-U-N-R-O-E.
You mentioned a couple of times about an 8-day clock. Can you just
8-day.
Can you talk a little about why there was an 8-day clock?
It runs for 8 days on one winding, and the purpose of that is you can wind it once a week, and even if you're a little forgetful, it'll keep running. So they are, and that phrase 8-day clock is how they're consistently identified in inventories and account books of the period.
David, on the clocks that have the painted fronts,
yeah,
is that done by a separate artist?
It
How
is.
was that commissioned?
And actually it was done in Boston. So there's a couple of newspaper advertisements, one taken by Curtis and Nolan On the Boston side, saying that a box of gilt frames, lower frames for patent timepieces had been lost on the way to Concord, and then Lemuel Curtis posted essentially the identical ad saying the same thing, that a box of these were lost. So it looks like there was no what's called ornamental painter. There was no ornamental painter in Concord at that date, probably 1816 when that was made. There were no gilders in Concord, so that work, the reverse painting and the gilding of the frames, was done in Boston. I think what happened was that William Munroe made the frames, they were sent into Boston to be gilt and to have that twist turning added, and then they were sent back out to Concord.
Quickly, what would be the value of one of these today at an auction, or if they were? Do you have some sense of that?
Depending on condition, the one on the right would be a small fortune. It would cost more than a luxury car and less than a house. The one in the middle in really very, very good condition might be $40,000 or more. And then the timepiece, what's usually called a banjo clock, the one on the left, they're extremely fragile things. And if you get one where absolutely nothing has happened to it, and they are very few, there might be 200 of these that come up in the major auction houses in a year, and not one of them is really intact. So it would be 5 figures too to land one of those. But meanwhile, you'll see any number of these selling for $800 or $1,000. That's because the glasses have been replaced, the dial's been repainted, stuff like that. And for these in the middle, if they lose that fret on the top, if they lose their feet, which happens very, very frequently, kind of kills them in the market. So you'll see a lot of variety in the prices that these things bring. Most likely that's attributable to condition.
Since he was so concerned with the working conditions when he was young, I wonder if you know anything about his situation, his treatment of his workers than when he was the master of the shop.
Right. Well, so I mentioned that when he was making furniture, he had no apprentices, he had no journeymen. He did everything himself. And that's what people usually assume for these 18th century shops, that it's one guy working like Geppetto at the bench and sawing everything out. It's just not the case. A shop like Benjamin Frothingham's in Charlestown, there might be 6 or 8 people in that shop, and that's why you can't identify a Frothingham piece by its construction. It's all over the place because these guys are trained in different places. Once you learn how to cut a dovetail, you never relearn it. So that's how you can identify who's making these things to a degree. So he had no journeymen or apprentices, no employees when he's a cabinet maker. When he starts making cases like the one on the left, as I mentioned, he's getting $3.50. He's paying his guy $1.25, but that's okay with Ebenezer Wood. Ebenezer Wood did pretty well by that. The same with I would say the same with the pencil making. He paid them, but there's a tremendous disparity. He was making a fortune on pencils, Ebenezer Wood and James Adams were able to make, using hand tools only, at a bench in a shop about 10 by 15 feet. In 1840, they made 1 million pencils. And William Munroe was making about 3 cents on every one. So, or no, it had to be less than that, but he was making more than a penny on every one. He was doing okay. And they would be paid $1 a day, $1.25 a day, let's say, is pretty good wages for a journeyman. But if you do that, you never get ahead, and you will die in debt. That's why William Munroe wanted to get away from the bench. Finally, he was able to do it, and he didn't die in debt. He died a significant creditor. He had lots of money for the period. Thank you.